At 52, Daniel thought he had finally figured money out. He had a good income. His mortgage was almost paid off. His kids were becoming independent. He had spent decades working, saving, and doing what he thought responsible adults were supposed to do. From the outside, Daniel looked financially secure. But there was one number he rarely looked at: his retirement account. Not because it was empty, because it wasn't nearly as large as he thought it should be. And that is where one of the biggest financial traps of your 50s begins. The dangerous part about your 50s isn't necessarily that you're spending too much. It isn't necessarily that you're earning too little. Sometimes, the biggest danger is believing that because you've made it this far, your financial decisions no longer have serious consequences. But they do. In fact, some decisions made between 50 and 59 can have consequences that follow you for the rest of your life. Because your 50s are a strange financial decade. You're old enough to have accumulated significant assets, but young enough to still make major financial mistakes. You're often earning more than you did in your 30s. You're approaching retirement. Your children may need help. Your parents may need help. And suddenly, your money isn't responsible for supporting just one future. It's being pulled in several directions at once. And the first trap is one that feels incredibly reasonable: trying to solve everyone else's financial problems before securing your own future. Imagine Daniel again. His daughter is struggling with college expenses. His son wants help with a down payment. His aging parents need occasional financial support. Daniel tells himself, "I've worked hard. I can handle it." So he takes money from his retirement savings. Maybe it's $10,000. Maybe it's $20,000. Maybe he co-signs a loan because he trusts his child. None of these decisions feels irresponsible. In fact, they can feel generous. But there is a financial principle hiding underneath them. Your children can borrow money for education. They can potentially borrow money for a home. They can work longer. They can change their lifestyle. But you cannot borrow money to fund your retirement in quite the same way. Once your working years end, your ability to recover financially becomes much smaller. And this is where something psychological happens. People in their 50s often feel caught between two identities. They want to be the parent who helps, the spouse who provides, the child who supports aging parents. And at the same time, they are supposed to become financially independent themselves. The problem is that being financially responsible for everyone can quietly become financially irresponsible toward yourself. But there is an even deeper trap. Because after decades of working, many people finally reach their 50s and decide, "I deserve to enjoy my money now." And emotionally, that makes perfect sense. Maybe you've spent 20 years driving an old car. Maybe you've postponed vacations. Maybe you've lived in a house that no longer fits your lifestyle. So you upgrade: a nicer vehicle, a larger house, more expensive vacations, more dinners out, more convenience. And because your income is higher than it was years ago, the payments don't immediately feel dangerous. But there is a problem. Your 50s are often the decade when the difference between income and wealth becomes impossible to ignore. You can earn $150,000 a year and still be financially vulnerable, because income tells you how much money comes in. Wealth tells you how much financial freedom you've actually built. And the closer you get to retirement, the more important that distinction becomes. A bigger house doesn't necessarily give you more retirement security. A luxury vehicle doesn't produce income. A lifestyle that requires $10,000 a month doesn't become safer simply because you can currently afford it. And that leads to one of the most dangerous financial illusions of your 50s: confusing a high income with being on track for retirement. You can feel successful because your paycheck is large, while quietly discovering that your financial life depends on that paycheck continuing for another decade. And that is a very different kind of security. But there's another trap hiding behind it. One that becomes especially dangerous when people begin looking at retirement as something that's close enough to start worrying about later. Because retirement isn't simply an age. It's a financial equation. And if the equation doesn't work, optimism cannot fill the gap. This is where Daniel made his second mistake. He looked at his retirement account and asked, "How much do I have?" But the more important question was, how much will I actually need? And those are two completely different questions. Because $500,000 can look enormous when you're staring at the balance, until you realize that it may need to support decades of housing, healthcare, food, insurance, taxes, travel, emergencies, and everything else that life throws at you. The number in the account is not the destination. It's the fuel. And the closer you get to retirement, the more carefully you have to calculate how far that fuel can actually take you. But there is another financial trap that makes this even harder. And unlike an expensive car or a bad investment, you may not even recognize it as a financial mistake when you're making it. It begins with something almost everyone wants in their 50s, the feeling that they have finally earned the right to stop worrying. But that feeling can become expensive. Because once people reach their 50s, they often start thinking differently about risk. In their 30s, retirement feels distant. A bad financial decision can potentially be repaired with another 20 or 30 years of work. In your 50s, the clock feels different, and that can create a strange contradiction. Some people become too conservative with their investments because they are afraid of losing what they have. Others become too aggressive because they suddenly realize they haven't saved enough. Both reactions can come from the same emotion, fear. Take Michael, 55. Michael has $400,000 invested for retirement. He watches the market fall sharply and becomes uncomfortable. He tells himself, I can't afford to lose this money. So he sells a large portion of his investments and moves the money into cash. At first, he feels relieved. The market continues falling. Michael feels like a genius. But eventually, the market begins recovering. And now Michael faces a different problem. He is afraid to get back in. Months become years. The money that was supposed to grow for retirement is sitting on the sidelines. This is the trap of letting a short-term emotional reaction control a long-term financial plan. But the opposite can also happen. Someone realizes at 57 that they are behind. They look at their retirement balance and think, I don't have enough time. So they start chasing higher returns, riskier investments, speculative stocks, cryptocurrency, aggressive bets. Maybe one investment doubles. That success creates confidence. And suddenly, the person who spent decades building wealth carefully starts gambling with the wealth they already have. The hidden problem isn't simply investment risk. It's that your 50s can create a powerful psychological temptation to make up for lost time. But you cannot force 10 years of wealth building into 1 year by taking 10 times the risk. Sometimes the smartest financial decision is not finding a spectacular investment. It's protecting the capital you've already spent decades building while continuing to grow it appropriately for your situation. And that brings us to another trap that becomes increasingly important in your 50s, ignoring healthcare. This is one of the easiest expenses to underestimate because healthcare isn't always sitting in your monthly budget as a giant, obvious bill. It exists in the background. Insurance premiums, deductibles, prescriptions, dental care, vision care, unexpected procedures, long-term care, and the possibility that one major medical event can dramatically change a retirement plan. Imagine Sarah, 54. She's calculated her retirement income carefully. Mortgage, food, utilities, travel. She has everything written down. But healthcare is treated as a small line item. Then she starts thinking about retirement at 62. The problem is that retiring before Medicare eligibility can create a completely different financial equation. Now she has to consider how she'll cover health insurance and out-of-pocket expenses before Medicare becomes available. The lesson isn't that retiring early is impossible. It isn't. The lesson is that retirement planning isn't just about asking, how much can I withdraw? It's also about asking, what could become unexpectedly expensive? And healthcare is only one example. Taxes are another. A retirement account balance is not necessarily the same thing as spendable money. If much of your retirement savings is held in tax-deferred accounts, future withdrawals may have tax consequences. That means a person can look at a large account balance and mentally spend every dollar of it. But the government may eventually take a portion through taxes. The exact impact depends on your situation, income, account types, deductions, and future tax rules. And that's why one of the biggest mistakes people make in their 50s is planning retirement around a single number. They say, I need $1 million. But $1 million for whom? Someone with a paid-off house? Someone still carrying a mortgage? Someone spending $4,000 a month? Someone spending $9,000? Someone with substantial healthcare expenses? Someone supporting another family member? The same balance can produce completely different lives. And this is where the real financial planning begins. Not with a magic number, with your personal spending reality. But there is another expense that can quietly destroy that equation. Debt. And not all debt behaves the same way. A mortgage at a manageable rate is different from high-interest credit card debt. A loan for something essential is different from borrowing to maintain a lifestyle. The danger in your 50s is not simply having debt. It's reaching retirement while your income is still carrying a large collection of monthly obligations. Imagine James. He earns $140,000 a year. His income is comfortable. But he has a mortgage, 2 car payments, credit card balances, and several personal loans. Every month, a large portion of his paycheck is already committed before he makes a single new decision. While he's working, this feels manageable. But what happens when the paycheck changes? That's the question people sometimes avoid asking. Because retirement doesn't just remove a salary. It can remove the flexibility that salary provides. When you're working, an unexpected $5,000 expense might mean working overtime, delaying a vacation, or adjusting your savings. In retirement, your options may be narrower. That's why reducing fixed expenses can sometimes be more powerful than simply trying to increase investment returns. And there is an especially dangerous form of debt that deserves attention. Debt created to maintain an image. The house that proves you succeeded. The car that tells people you've made it. the vacation that makes retirement look more comfortable than it actually is. At 52, nobody wants to feel like they're going backward. So lifestyle can become a form of identity. And once your identity becomes attached to a certain standard of living, reducing expenses can feel emotionally painful. You aren't just cutting spending. You feel like you're admitting that you can't afford the life you've built. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Financial freedom is not the ability to maintain an expensive lifestyle forever. It's the ability to choose your lifestyle without being controlled by your expenses. And that distinction becomes incredibly important as retirement approaches. Because there is one final trap that connects almost everything we've talked about. And it may be the most dangerous of all. Waiting. Waiting to calculate the retirement number. Waiting to reduce debt. Waiting to review investments. Waiting to plan healthcare. Waiting to decide what kind of life you actually want. The reason waiting feels harmless is that nothing dramatic happens today. The account doesn't suddenly disappear. The mortgage doesn't suddenly become unaffordable. The lifestyle doesn't suddenly collapse. But financial problems rarely become dangerous in one day. They become dangerous through years of small decisions that were postponed. And that is why your 50s shouldn't be viewed as the decade when you panic. They should be viewed as the decade when you become extremely intentional. Because you still have something incredibly valuable. Time. Maybe not as much time as you had at 30, but enough time to make meaningful changes. Enough time to increase savings. Enough time to reduce expensive debt. Enough time to reassess your investment strategy. Enough time to rethink your lifestyle. And enough time to discover that retirement security isn't created by one brilliant decision. It's created by dozens of ordinary decisions made consistently. But there's one more thing Daniel eventually realized. The biggest threat wasn't the expensive car. It wasn't helping his children. It wasn't even the size of his retirement account. The biggest threat was that he had been measuring financial success by how comfortable his life looked today, instead of asking how sustainable that comfort would be tomorrow. And that realization changed the way he looked at everything. Daniel eventually sat down and looked at his finances differently, not as a collection of accounts, not as a collection of bills, not as a scorecard of how successful he had become, but as a plan for the rest of his life. And that changed the questions he asked. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" he started asking, "What does this decision do to my future freedom?" That is a much harder question. Because you can technically afford many things while still making a poor financial decision. You can afford a bigger house and still be putting pressure on your retirement. You can afford a luxury vehicle and still be sacrificing investment growth. You can afford to help your children and still be weakening your own financial foundation. You can afford another vacation and still be creating a lifestyle that becomes difficult to maintain later. Affordability is about today. Sustainability is about the future. And your 50s are when that difference becomes much more important. So Daniel began with something surprisingly simple. He calculated what his life actually cost. Not what he hoped it would cost. Not what he thought retirement should cost. What his household genuinely spent. Housing, food, insurance, transportation, healthcare, taxes, travel, family support, everything. Then he separated expenses into two categories. The things that created genuine value in his life, and the things he was paying for because they had slowly become normal. That distinction matters, because cutting everything isn't financial wisdom. You don't need to make your life miserable to build wealth. The goal is to spend intentionally. If a vacation gives you memories you'll value for decades, that's different from spending money simply because everyone around you is upgrading. If a larger home genuinely improves your family's life and fits your long-term finances, that's different from buying it because you want to prove that you've succeeded. The question isn't, "Can I spend this money?" The better question is this the best use of this money? That question can change an entire financial life. And then Daniel looked at his retirement plan. Instead of focusing only on the account balance, he considered the income that his assets could realistically support. He looked at when he wanted to retire, how much he expected to spend, what sources of income might be available, how healthcare could affect the plan, how taxes could affect withdrawals, and what would happen if retirement came earlier than expected. That last question is uncomfortable, but it is important. Because many people build retirement plans around the assumption that they'll work until a specific age. But life doesn't always cooperate. A job can disappear. A company can restructure. A health problem can change someone's ability to work. A family responsibility can arrive unexpectedly. Planning only for the retirement you hope to have is incomplete. You also need to think about the retirement you might be forced to have. And that is why a financial plan in your 50s should include some margin. Not because you should live in fear, but because flexibility is one of the most valuable assets you can own. Then came another difficult conversation. Family. Daniel realized that helping his children did not have to mean sacrificing his retirement. He could still be supportive. But support could take different forms. Instead of automatically writing a large check, he could help his children understand budgeting. He could contribute an amount that didn't undermine his own financial security. He could establish boundaries. And most importantly, he could stop confusing love with unlimited financial responsibility. That is a lesson many parents struggle with, because saying no to your child can feel selfish. But sometimes the most responsible thing you can do for your family is make sure you don't become financially dependent on them later. Your financial stability is part of what you leave your children, not just money, but freedom. And then Daniel confronted another uncomfortable reality. He had been using his income to measure how successful he was. So he changed the measurement. Instead of asking, "How much do I make?" he began asking, "How much of my income is creating future freedom?" That is a completely different metric. Someone earning $200,000 and spending nearly all of it can have less financial flexibility than someone earning $100,000 and consistently building assets. Income can create opportunity, but behavior determines what happens to that opportunity. And this is where the traps of your 50s become much easier to understand. The expensive lifestyle isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is when the lifestyle becomes dependent on income that cannot continue forever. Helping your children isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is helping them by sacrificing your own financial independence. Investment risk isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is allowing fear or desperation to make investment decisions for you. Debt isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is carrying obligations that reduce your options as retirement approaches. Healthcare isn't something to fear. The problem is pretending it won't affect the retirement equation. And getting older isn't the problem. The problem is reaching a stage of life where time becomes more valuable while continuing to make decisions as though you have unlimited amounts of it. That may be the deepest financial lesson of your 50s. Time has changed. At 25, you can make a mistake and have decades to recover. At 35, you still have a long runway. At 45, you can make significant adjustments. But in your 50s, every year becomes more valuable. Not because your life is ending, because your financial decisions have less time to compound. That means your goal shouldn't be to become wealthy overnight. It should be to become harder to financially break. Lower unnecessary fixed expenses. Build appropriate reserves. Invest according to your circumstances and risk tolerance. Reduce high-cost debt. Understand your retirement income. Plan for healthcare. Set boundaries around family support. And most importantly, create a lifestyle that can survive beyond your paycheck. Because retirement isn't really about stopping work. It's about gaining the ability to make choices without needing every decision to produce a paycheck. And that brings us back to Daniel. Remember the man who thought he had finally figured money out? His biggest realization wasn't that he had failed. He hadn't. He had simply reached a point where the rules had changed. For decades, his greatest financial asset had been his ability to earn. Now, his greatest financial asset was becoming something else. His ability to protect what he had built. That distinction is easy to miss. When you're younger, wealth building is often about accumulation. Earn, save, invest, grow. But as you move closer to retirement, wealth management becomes increasingly about coordination. Your investments, your spending, your taxes, your healthcare, your debt, your family obligations, your housing, your time. They all have to work together. And that's why the biggest financial traps of your 50s aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they're incredibly ordinary. A bigger car, a larger home, a loan for a child, a few years of delayed investing, a retirement plan that was never actually calculated, an investment decision made during a market panic, a lifestyle that quietly became more expensive every year. None of these decisions has to destroy your finances by itself. The danger comes when several of them happen at the same time. So if you're in your 50s, don't ask only whether you're doing well. Ask whether the life you're living today can financially survive the life you're planning for tomorrow. Because the goal isn't to reach retirement looking wealthy. The goal is to reach it with choices. Choices about where you live. Choices about how you spend your time. Choices about whether you continue working. Choices about helping your family. Choices about the kind of life you want to live. That's what financial security really buys. Not a bigger number on a statement. Not an impressive car in the driveway. Not the appearance of success. Freedom. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is this. Your 50s are not the end of your financial story. They're the point where the story becomes more intentional. You still have time. You still have income. You still have choices. But now, those choices deserve more attention. Because the financial decisions you make today may not just determine how comfortable the next few years are. They may determine how much freedom you have for the decades that follow. And that is why the smartest thing you can do in your 50s isn't to chase the life that looks richest. It's to build the life that remains secure when the paycheck finally stops.